Ooh, scandalous. Oh, hey, didn't see you there. I was just reading up on these two emperors, Honorius and Arcadius. The year is 395 AD. Emperor Theodosius the Great has just died, leaving the throne to his two sons, Honorius and Arcadius. Dividing the empire in half, he had Arcadius rule from the east and Honorius from the west. However, in this time, Rome's not doing so hot, falling victim to corruption, civil war, barbarian invasions, and economic devastation.
The power of the Senate was taken from the many and given to the few. Those who wore the golden wreath grew sick with every kind of wickedness. They were filled with greed, deceit, and malice. They condemned and enslaved. They betrayed their friends and murdered those they loved. They did all this and called it just.
In these dark times, Rome needed a hero, and Theodosius the Great was just the hero it needed. However, on his passing, he left the empire to the worst caretakers they could imagine, Honorius and Arcadius. Arcadius was the older of the two brothers, aged 18 when his father passed and he took the mantle. Arcadius was a pious Christian who even ordered the destruction of all pagan temples in the empire, one of his most well-known acts. And he always tried to comport himself as a devout follower. But though he had religious zeal, which may be the cause of his wife, as we'll get to later, actual governing was much less his specialty. He was content to let his ministers and wife puppet him. Weak-willed, Arcadius rarely made decisions on his own, and was often bullied into ordering certain actions by people within and outside his court. But where Arcadius was inept, Honorius was utterly hopeless. Weak-spined, xenophobic, lustful, and selfish. The beginning of his rule was nevertheless stable. His dominating general, Flavius Stilicho, was a capable commander, able to save the empire many times from barbarian menaces. However, Honorius was eventually convinced to kill Stilicho, shooting himself in the foot. 2 years later, the city of Rome was sacked. When he heard of this terrible news, he cried out, believing his favorite chicken, also named Rome, had fallen, only relieved of his grief when he found that the bird was all right. Little did Honorius know that Colonel Sanders had actually taken the chicken Rome and used it to make a nice bucket of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Safe to say that irreparable damage was done to the empire under the rule of these two brothers. Though it is notable that the eastern half did last a while longer. But it begs the question, how did the brothers turn out so poorly? What psychological factors made them poor rulers? That is what we're going to discuss today. Oh wow, a Greek one. Guys need to stop rolling up on me like that. I'm sorry, I'm just not too dedicated to making this project. Just like the emperors were not dedicated to ruling. I have a little theory on why they turned out so poorly. Let's take a look. What is interesting about these two emperors, unlike some in the past, they were born in the purple, meaning that from birth, they were destined to be emperors. So, from their earliest days, they lived palace life, surrounded by ministers, advisors, and they had all their needs taken care to. They got to wear fancy clothes, eat whatever they wanted, and generally live a life of safety and luxury. But I think there's something deeper at play here. You see, Theodosius wanted them, he knew they'd be young, so he wanted them to be under care. He placed Arcadius under the care of the minister, Rufinus, and he placed Honorius under the care of the general, Flavius Stilicho. My theory is simple. I believe that living in court life and knowing that they were pliable to their advisors, always following whoever was in charge at the time, even though it should have been them, they learned to never act on themselves and to never think on their own, constantly being manipulated for other purposes. But let's take a look at the perspectives and really dig in deep. Let's start with the biological perspective. Sons of Theodosius. One interesting thing is that despite being sons of a well-accomplished, smart emperor, Arcadius and Honorius seem to not inherit any of his leadership skills. Unfortunately, the Romans didn't have any fancy genetic records or anything like that, so any information is conjecture. Still, one must wonder how the children ended up so inept. Likely, other factors, like upbringing, were far more important to their personalities and character than the genes of their great father. Let's start with the social perspective. And our first thing to look at is being born in the purple. Being the sons of Theodosius the Great, from infancy, they were raised in the luxury and shelteredness of palace life. This meant that servants tended to every need, and everything from cooking to cleaning was out of their hands. They could do what they wanted, when they wanted to. However, being in palace life, they were constantly surrounded by advisors and officials who wanted to advance their own standing and push their agenda through the young emperors who were not old enough to rule upon their father's passing. We'll talk about this later on. Therefore, the two brothers were heavily spoiled, most likely, and surrounded by conniving, manipulative officials. Let's also look at the late imperial culture for social perspective. By the late 4th century, Roman identity had changed significantly. Now, Roman could mean Italian, Romano-British, Romano-Gallic, Romano-Greek, etc. However, the Romans were still very nationalistic and against outsiders. Xenophobia was high at the time, especially after Theodosius settled the Goths inside of Roman territory. And both the brothers would show this attitude towards barbarians. Honorius executed his half-Vandal general, for instance, and refused to parley with the Goths. Additionally, the late empire was heavily Christian, and this really comes out in Arcadius, who made lots of Christian edicts and rules. Let's take a look into the cognitive perspective, starting off with Honorius and his puppeted mind. Being constantly overseen and jockeyed for, Honorius probably never learned how to think for himself and apply his mind to the issues of the empire. Everyone from the Pope, who made him write a religious letter to his brother, to various ministers were in his ear. Because of this, Honorius usually deferred to whoever was at hand. Stilicho had this influence for a while, which was a good thing. But an advisor named Olympius convinced Honorius that Stilicho was a grave danger to his position on the throne. And, because of this, Stilicho was killed. There were a few times he did act independently, but they were rash, off-the-cuff decisions that show a lack of logical processing. Probably from not being able to make his own decisions early in life, when the Goths came to Italy after Stilicho's execution and gave lenient terms that actually would have made sense, Honorius defied them, and this action led to Rome being sacked and hastened the fall of the empire. As for Arcadius, he's in a similar situation. He was also dominated by ministers and advisors. The first was Rufinus, who was very unpopular. After he fell, came Eutropius, who also became equally unpopular, even causing an Ostrogothic revolt. Even after this, a man named Gaius joined the rebels and forced Arcadius to make him the chief general of all of the eastern armies. But the biggest influence on them all was his wife, Eudoxia. She seemed to control his religious thinking heavily, having him destroy all non-Christian temples in an edict, for example. Many contemporaries spoke out against this in the church, trying to curb her influence. However, didn't really work. So, it can be deduced that similarly to Honorius, Arcadius never really got to exercise cognitive freedom and had all of his decisions regarding the state of the Eastern Roman Empire made for him. Those who did not like it simply took control over him. Let's switch over to the humanistic perspective. And I call this section Never Independent. The brothers were never free from the influence of those around them, and therefore were probably unable to turn inward and fix their deficiencies. Likely, they never really got above the safety needs of Maslow's hierarchy, as all of their marriages and friendships were political in nature, and all of those close to them tried to use them for personal purposes. Along with being given anything they probably wanted, at least materially, and never actually having to do anything but sit and make orders that their advisors made for them, they never really had a chance to reflect or look inward. They probably just trudged on in life, enjoying the pleasures and doing whatever they were told. Now, let's dive into the psychodynamic perspective. This is the hardest one to tackle of all. We know very little of the upbringing of the emperors, save for that they grew up in palace life and under care of oppressive ministers. It's possible that both of them suffered denial, refusing to acknowledge the consequences of their actions. However, this could also be explained by saying they never experienced the effects of what they did, being sheltered and all. However, one thing does stand out. Honorius, late in his life, attempted to seduce his half-sister. One perhaps could go Freudian on this. Maybe he suffers some form or variation of the Oedipus complex, and he did have another sister growing up. Maybe he never fully left that phallic stage. But we'll never know. Finally, let's go evolutionary on this. Both emperors overwhelmingly exhibit self-survival and selfish urges, and ignore the well-being of the group. This group being the Roman Empire, no less. While it was probably easier to let advisors make decisions for them, they also likely knew that if they didn't go along, they could be assassinated or deposed, as often happened, and they didn't have strong enough personalities to resist this. They also seemed prone to jealousy and fear, as Honorius was quick to sack his greatest general, likely seeing him as a threat, or at least being convinced as such. Additionally, they showed great fear of outside threats. Honorius fled to the city of Ravenna when Alaric and the Goths came, and I think that's a flight response, locking himself inside the safety of its fortifications. When the Ostrogoths rose up in the east, Arcadius weakly and quickly made their leader the Magister Militum of his entire military. It seems pretty self-preserving to give in so easily. And I think this shows the evolutionary perspective well, as they were in it for self-survival. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, to me, though obviously we don't have all the details, and it is ancient history, the records may lie. But it seems as though the two young emperors, who pretty much from birth were being overseen by advisors, never got to think for themselves. They never got to experience outside the palace. They never got to learn the intricacies of governance, because they always had people in their ears telling them, do this. And because of this, they became weak-willed and pliable, and simply indulgent in what palace life had to offer. And it's rather unfortunate, since at this time the empire needed great heroes like their father Theodosius, and they made things certainly far worse. Could be argued even that under their reigns, especially that of Honorius, the empire's fall was brought to bear. However, that's a discussion for a different time. Now I must leave you to get back on my business. Thank you.